All right, let's talk about sprint planning meeting. As a Scrum Masters, how should one be thinking about planning and facilitating this meeting?
Yeah, let's do it. Sprint planning. We're going to assume here that you've done a couple of backlog refinement or pre-sprint planning. So the team had chance to look over the user story, what's coming up. They've sized, hopefully some of them higher level, and have added any details that they need to add on those. So we're going to assume that for this conversation. So if we've done that, the way I would facilitate a sprint planning meeting would be as a facilitator, I definitely want to learn if any of the team members are going to be taking off time and things like that. So just kind of calculating the capacity if it's a brand new team or newer team. But if you also already have established velocity, then just really learning who's out and giving the opportunity for the team to okay, this is your velocity, given Sam and Brittany are out. What do you guys want to commit to, kind of thing?
Yeah.
And so I like to kick off my sprint planning, or my recommendations for sprint planning would be, depending on when you're maybe having a short check-in. If a lot of times, I've done early morning, the day of the sprint. So we won't have a daily stand-up that day. We'll do planning the very first thing in the morning. So maybe what do we kind of need from each other to just really be here for next hour and a half, whatever time we might need. And so we'll do that. And then after I do that, I usually, as a Scrum Master, I like to, again, pass it to the product owner for them to kind of walk through the product backlog and see what items that are on the top of the product backlog. So now that we can start to go through them and talk about them one more time. I don't recommend overly spending too much time on the user story that we've already gone through and talked about, just because we've already done that. But if there's any action items that were from prior session and that were taken on and we are coming together and talking about that user story specifically, we would do that. So I usually kick it off to the product owner and say, hey, why don't we just kind of go through each of the user stories, and just to make sure that nothing has changed from the last time that we met for the planning meeting or the pre-planning meeting. So we'll do that. And then the purpose, again, for the planning sessions is the input is the user stories, and the output is the sprint goal. What are we walking away with? What are we committing to as a team for next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever your time box might be? And so I'll have the product owner go through each of the user story. Again, my role as a facilitator, making sure that everybody's voice is being heard and it's not just one person. And if we need to resize, so I might use words like, based on revisiting and looking through the acceptance criteria, do we have to resize anything? And so if the teams feel so, then I'll facilitate a short estimation session again for that user story. And we'll do that for each of the user stories. And then we'll, on whatever tracking, Jira or whatever tracking tool, so we'll say, create a new sprint, and the product owner and the team, together as a team, we will drag each of the user stories into the new sprint until obviously whatever the velocity or the capacity for the team is reached. And then once we do that, then getting a commitment from the team. And this is a very important aspect of it. A lot of people don't feel comfortable or kind of miss that, but the team, it's a good idea for the team to hear from each other that we're committed to whatever the goal might be. So coming up with a goal, writing the goal based on what the team is committing to. A lot of times it's not just the user story, but the outcome is, if we complete this set of user story or this functionality, how are we adding a value to the customer?
Right.
Or the stakeholder? What is the output we're getting out of this? And so that usually should be the goal, because again, things in the sprint sometimes can change. And we allow that change in Agile, right? But is it related to the goal? If it's not, can that be in the upcoming sprint? And so allowing that flexibility, so really committing to the goal versus the user stories. And after that, giving the team, getting that buy-in committed, I usually facilitate a fist to 5, how comfortable do you feel? And kind of facilitating that, getting that, yes, we feel comfortable. 5 4 or 5, it's like, okay, we're pretty good with what we're committing to. And if there's other numbers, lower numbers, then we'll have that conversation again. Hey, why don't you feel that you can say 4 or 5? Like, what do we need to talk about? And so doing that. And then I usually like to also give a team maybe last 10, 15 minutes just for them to come up with a goal, like for themselves. There's a sprint goal, but like, who wants to work on what, instead of product owner or a scrum master deciding that, let the team decide that, so they can kind of talk among and see who wants to tackle what.
Gotcha.
So doing that, and then closing the planning, and they can go out their way and start working on the sprint.
Yeah. And as far as like when we were talking about it, so we talked about, doing 2 refinement sessions, pre-planning sessions before coming in.
Yeah.
And obviously Scrum Guide says it's a 4-hour time box for a 2-week sprint. So if it's a 1-week sprint, think about a 2 hours planning.
Yeah.
It's more of a recommendation. And like you said, it depends on the maturity of the team, the complexity of the product that they're building. It depends on the various things. But what you're saying is when you were in teams, you've just ran 1.5 to 2 hours planning session if the refinement has been done really well.
Exactly. I mean, if we don't need to revisit and talk about each of the user stories again, then it's just a matter of running through them, making sure that nothing has changed. There's no new learned information, and just adding those, creating a new sprint, adding those, dragging those, and coming up with a goal, and then committing and going our way for the sprint to start the work.
Got you. Any anti-pattern as a facilitator, Scrum Master, any anti-patterns that you're looking for in the planning meeting?
Yeah. Big thing is not getting a commitment.
Yeah.
Other big thing, we've already talked about this, but other big thing, the commitment, and also if there's any dependencies, like really looking at the definition of done, comparing each of the user stories to that, making sure that it meets the definition of done, or not the definition of done, definition of ready. Correction here, definition of ready. So like if we have dependencies, do we really want to bring that in? Like the team sometimes like say, yeah, we'll do it. And then, as a Scrum Master, you want to say, oh, well, it sounds like it doesn't quite meet your definition of ready. Do you really want to bring that in? Because that's part of your working agreement, right?
Yeah.
And so that might be a major ones. I would say those 2, and then not coming up with a sprint goal. So commitment goal, and not if certain user stories don't meet the definition of ready.
Got you.
Because you shouldn't even size really if it doesn't meet definition of ready.
Yeah. And earlier in the conversation, you mentioned capacity planning, and how might a new Scrum Master go about understanding how that's done, and how that plays into the planning meeting?
Yeah, no, good question. If the team is new, my recommendation, what I usually like to do is, there's ways to calculate certain capacity, but like really getting a buy-in from the team, right?
Yeah.
Because we're trying to create self-organizing, autonomous teams. And so if I don't give that autonomy to the team, and okay, well, we don't know what our capacity is yet, but we have 3-4 people, getting that idea from them, like, well, how many user stories do you guys really want to commit to?
Yeah.
And keeping an open mind and experimenting that, okay, if we have a team of 5 people and we brought in like, let's just say 30 points worth of user story as a team, like that's what they agreed to, helping them understand that, hey, if we do finish user stories by all the user stories, everything is done by, the 10th day or whatever, and we have a couple of days remaining, allowing that space that, hey, we can take in more work. So we haven't learned our capacity yet. At that time, let's just bring more user stories in at that time. Gotcha. So keeping that space and teaching them that is totally acceptable, and giving them that autonomy. I think when things are kind of forced and say, well, you guys are 4 or 5 people, commit to 50, 60. Like, well, the team is new. They don't even know how to work with each other. So you have to gather data.
Right. Yeah.
Gather data for some time so that you learn, and the teams obviously learn from each other on what they can handle.
Let's talk about backlog refinement. So as a Scrum Master, how should we plan for and facilitate backlog refinement meeting?
Yeah. Backlog refinement as a Scrum Master, a couple of things even before planning, right? Like backlog refinement or pre-planning or pre-sprint planning, whatever you want to call it. I think as a Scrum Master, depending on like how active your product owner is, one thing before even scheduling a backlog refinement session is really having that conversation with them and making sure that they do have a list of user stories ready for the team to look at for like what's upcoming for next sprint.
So you're saying like you would just sit down with the product owner and kind of look at like the upcoming stories and
like especially in the beginning, I feel like if sometimes like the product owner knows their role, okay, I got a backlog refinement is coming up. I got to get, a number of user stories ready for their team to look at, prioritize, talk to stakeholder, whatever they need to do. But I've also worked with product owners that don't know that's like kind of like their role, active role. And so I've had to sit with them or before even backlog refinement, hey, like I'm going to schedule a backlog refinement. When do you want that? Do you feel like you're going to have few user stories that are going to be ready for the team to start looking at to create that shared understanding for them to know what's kind of coming up, right? And so we might already have a list of user stories on the product backlog already. Depends on how large that is, how refined that already is. But that's kind of as a Scrum Master mentally what I'm thinking about. And as we come into the backlog refinement, if it's a brand new team, I might do a little bit of like, what is the expectation? What are we really going to do in the next hour and a half that we've scheduled? So it's really important for the team to understand that before just kind of jumping in and like starting to talk about.
This is like right after the check-in or like
like before like a check-in. I might do a check-in, maybe like just really, and the purpose really again with the check-ins is to get the team to like, okay, what do we need from each other for the next hour and a half to be really present. The teams come from they're maybe working on an activity or like they're coding and they're coming to this meeting. Maybe they have certain things that they've thought about, thinking about. So you want them to kind of clear their hair, center their head. And that's why we do check-ins, right? And so we'll do that. And then after that, I might explain the purpose and the outcome. Like, what are we looking to get out of what's the input and the output
and
out of the backlog refinement or the pre-planning.
Can we quickly review like the purpose and outcome? Like how do you see?
The way I see purpose of a backlog refinement is to look at the product backlog and create that shared understanding more than anything. And maybe we need to break down certain user stories, add more acceptance criteria, like the product owner or the BA on the team maybe would have done some of that, but maybe they haven't taken the developer's perspective quite yet. So these sessions are really used to understand who, what, and why. And then do we have enough details? Do we understand it enough, right? As a Scrum Master, I like to actively think about if I have a QA in the team, do they have enough information that they can write test cases? And then the developers know enough information. Again, these sessions are not for the developers to go into solutioning. I do see that sometimes where the developers kind of talk about the how, but that's actually figured out during the sprint itself. So they have to be thinking about, they have to really understand the who, what, and why. And do we have enough information? Do I understand it enough that I can probably estimate? And I have a general idea on how I might tackle that user story as a developer. That's what we're trying to get out of the pre-planning or backlog refinement.
So purpose, like this is a pre-sprint planning meeting, creating shared understanding of what the work is in the backlog, sizing, prioritizing, ordering, cleaning up the backlog, adding new items. So it's an activity for that. And the outcome of this activity is like a clear understanding of like understanding of the user stories that are on the top of the backlog.
Absolutely.
And the team understanding, okay, these are the things that are coming up. This is the kind of the work, this is the scope, things like that.
And then so let me talk a little bit about if I'm a Scrum Master, how I might facilitate this. Right. And so I'll do a quick check-in just to kind of get everybody in the same room, same page. And then if it's a new team, if this are my first few that I'm running or facilitating as a Scrum Master, I want to make sure that the team understands the purpose and the outcome so that they're in the rhythm of like what's actually going to happen during these sessions. And then my role after that is I'm going to pass it to the product owner or the BA, somebody from a business perspective, product perspective, and kind of let them drive the meeting, rest of the meeting. But what I'm looking for as a Scrum Master, as a facilitator during these sessions that I want to keep an eye out is just because I hand it off. It's not that I just sit back and do nothing. You play a very, very important role as a Scrum Master in this session. So a few things to keep in mind. One thing is, is everybody engaged in the room? There's going to be quieter people and there's going to be talkative people, right? So now you got to put your facilitator hat and say, okay, like it's everybody's voice being heard, or is it just the one person like taking the lead? And so if that is the case, I might have to use certain techniques, facilitation techniques, to get some of those other people, quieter people, give them a chance to involve them. So I might say something like, can we hear from somebody who we haven't heard from yet? Or like, hey, Sam, do you feel the same way that Brittany's feeling? Do you have the same understanding of this user story as he has? And so just kind of allowing those conversations to happen. Another thing I want to pay attention on is how long, like, are we talking about each user story, right? And so as a facilitator, I want to make sure I'm time boxing to a certain time, maybe like 8 minutes, 9 minutes per user story. Anytime it goes lengthier than that, that means maybe we need to create a spike. Maybe we just don't have enough understanding of the user story. Does it require like different design? Do we need to involve somebody from the architecture team? So understanding those different aspect of it and being able to say as a facilitator, I might not understand the technical, what the developers are saying, but sensing that and saying, I'm sensing that we're going into a solutioning mode right now. Am I sensing that correctly? So using languages like that, where you're not breaking that conversation abruptly, but like, hey guys, I want to pull us back. I'm sensing we're going into this. Am I sensing that correctly? Right? Like I want to remind you again, the purpose of the backlog refinement again is now we don't want to go into solutioning, but here are some things that we want to understand. And so doing that time boxing, and then making sure everybody is engaged. And then if we feel like we have enough information on the user story, can we at least like estimate? Right. And so as a facilitator, I might estimate a session like this. I might say, do you guys feel like you have enough information to size the user story now? Get a buy-in, thumbs up from the team. And I might say, well, in a count of 3, why don't you guys point? What do you think? And I want you guys to point at the same time. So there's no, we're not pointing based on what other person might be saying, because that does happen a lot. Also, so I might say 3, 2, 1 point. And so then now, again, allowing for that other conversation. If Brittany says a 5 and Sam says a 2, it's not up to me as a facilitator. It's not up to the product owner on coming up with a number. It's the developers. They need to have that conversation. Well, Brittany, you thought it was a 5. Sam, you thought it was a 2. Why don't you guys have a conversation why you thought that way? Right.
So you're generating perspective.
Exactly.
Around how they're thinking about
tackling that
story. So the conversation itself, when that happens, so there's new information and new knowledge that takes place, new questions that help.
And we're sharing each other's expertise already, right? Like you might say, well, I was going to do this, Sam. And then Sam might say, well, we already have certain things in place. So here's how I was thinking about tackling this. So then now Brittany might be like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I agree with that. In that case, I'm okay to change to 2. And so then now they come to a number themselves, and then we'll put that on the user story, and we'll keep repeating this until like whatever time allocation we had for that day. And then we would move on to another user story and continue that.
So that's a great point. So it's not necessarily about like 2, 3, or 5. It's the conversation that happens and the understanding that comes after that conversation.
And estimation, like it takes a while for teams to really like understand estimation and effort, right? And so if it's a brand new team, you might even have to do a little bit of a teaching on what is estimation, why do we estimate, what is Fibonacci sequence versus like estimating in time, all that stuff. Separate conversation, obviously, but you as a facilitator, you do want to have that knowledge so you can help the team understand how to think about estimation and just understand that it's going to take some time for them to really learn the work, how their systems interact. If it's a new forming team versus they've been with each other for a while, there's a lot of different parts that play into estimation. So just understanding and continuing to educate the team as you're with them over time.
Got you. And what have you seen in your experience? Cadence, like how often are these refinement sessions happening? What's a healthy way of doing time box wise?
Right. I would say at least 2 refinement sessions before the actual planning. Okay. And here's why. Because plannings are so much more productive if we meet a couple of times before the actual sprint planning.
Got you.
The teams would have had a chance to look at the user stories, if they had any questions, if there's any action items. Sometimes the action item might be for the product owner that they need to go and learn more information about the requirement. Sometimes it might be technical things that the developers might need to look at. Sometimes it could be simple as following up with another team because there's a dependencies and we want to make sure that the other team can get their work done before we bring our work into the sprint. So it's really, you can have those earlier on versus like, let's just say we come to a planning day and we learn all this information and we're trying to plan our sprint. And that's why I'm not like a huge fan of having 4-hour planning that split that. And whether you call it a pre-planning meeting or backlog refinement, doing those, it's going to help you have very effective sprint planning.
Got you. Any anti-patterns or any patterns that you see that you're observing as a Scrum Master in the refinement meeting?
Yeah, I think I mentioned one earlier. A major one obviously is solutioning. So if the teams, I've like had, Scrum Masters tell me, some of the, Scrum Masters that I coach tell me, oh yeah, like we don't know how to narrow it down. And we have teams like literally talk about user story for an hour, one single user story. That's a huge red flag.
Wow.
Right? It's like, there's something majorly wrong that we need to probably discover more on this. But if they're going into solutioning mode, if people are really not engaged, if it's just one person talking all the time and giving their input, and those would be the major ones. And other kind of sometimes product owner kind of overtaking and maybe even saying like, oh yeah, like no, it shouldn't be more than this for you guys or your effort, right? Yeah. That's another thing I've sometimes seen, because as a product owner, you understand from a business context, not from a development context. You haven't lived in the code, right? The developers live in the code. So you let them decide.
Perfect. Yeah. Kavita, let's talk about daily stand-up meeting and the involvement of a Scrum Master in a daily stand-up meeting.
Yeah, for sure. Daily stand-up is really, daily Scrum, daily stand-up, whatever you may call it. It's really to plan and replan. And it's not a status. It's not to collect status as a Scrum Master or as a product owner, or even for the team to give statuses. It's really, where are we in terms of our committed items? Like every day, how much improvement have we made to whatever our committed items were, or what our sprint goal is. And so as a Scrum Master, the best way to facilitate, or the effective way to facilitate, is having some sort of like a visible board so that the teams can see the user stories, and we can see where they're at with each of the user story. The best method to conduct a stand-up I found is to walking the board. So instead of like calling on each person and making it seem like that person is giving a status, or even like the person passing it to another person, the best way to do is have a board up, go through each of the user stories, and whoever's involved in that user story, they just talk about it. And other things that you want to keep in mind is just like, how are the user story being talked about? Meaning like, as they're giving updates to each other, how are they giving updates to each other? Meaning, is it just like yesterday I worked on user story 4, 5, 7, 8, and I'm going to continue today? Or is it, hey, yesterday I worked on user story 4, 5, 7. Here's what I did for the user story, and here's what I have pending. And by end of the day or end of tomorrow, whatever, here's where it's going to get to.
Yeah.
Right. So then there's more information that is communicated with each other. And if another developer needs to show up to help, then they can provide better perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So if like, let's just say you and I are coding on a user story and I communicate what I'm doing and what I have left, maybe you have a better method or a better way of doing that.
Yeah.
And so by hearing my communication, you can provide a perspective on what could I do different, or if I'm stuck on a specific thing, then you can say, hey, why don't we get together after this? And I might be able to show you a couple of things.
Yeah.
Right. So that's very important. Other things are important, just like really time boxing. So as a Scrum Master, sometimes the teams can kind of derail and like they can go on and on. So how do we really stop that person? Right.
Yeah.
So I might say something like, thanks for the update. It sounds like some of the stuff that you're saying might need to be communicated or talked about after the 15-minute. Do you mind waiting until everybody kind of goes and, you guys can get together?
Yeah.
Because if I ask a question, I've seen this all the time. Yeah. If I say, oh, I'm working on this, here's what I've done, but like, here's what I have question on.
Yeah.
I mean, other developer might jump on and like, they might try to give them an answer right then and there.
Yeah.
So as a facilitator, it's important for me to say, hey, Tom, that's really great. Why don't we wait until like we're done and you and Sam can get together and you guys can figure this out.
Nice.
So that's important. Other things in a daily stand-up, I mean, it can, at some point, like it can kind of become boring and kind of go through the motions. So just also recognizing sometimes like we think, stand-ups are important, but like you want to identify other things like how are the teams communicating outside of that, right? Like if you notice that, Sam had some sort of questions about the user story midday and he waited until the next day to ask that question on a stand-up, like that's a teaching method, like right then and there that like you might have to sit with that person and help them understand that, hey, like why they don't have to wait. Like, why don't you get on a conversation, ping in the group, here's what I have. Can somebody jump in a call and, help me with this? So just some of those minor things, but things too for a Scrum Master to kind of keep in mind and look out for.
Yeah.